The time, 18. Shot, Jordan, Michael Jordan.
Collins driving, almost lost the handle. Chalmers for the tie. Got it with 2 seconds. Unbelievable.
3 seconds at midcourt.
Jenkins
Gives it to Jenkins for the championship.
Guys, and welcome back to another episode of Jackson Talks. I'm Jackson, and I'm a Seton Hall fan.
I'm Greg, and I go to Indiana University, so I'm obviously an Indiana Hoosier fan.
So we have Greg today. I actually been to a Seton Hall, Indiana game. First year of the Archie Miller era, so Seton Hall did win.
It doesn't surprise me. Yeah, we can talk about Archie all we want.
I do remember that a Indiana player stole the ball from a Seton Hall player without a shoe on. That I remember. It was pretty impressive. But so since Zol is or Greg is a big Indiana fan, we are going to get a preview from him today about Indiana. And there's also some huge news on Indiana, which we'll get to in the end with you guys.
I mean, that's kind of what instigated this me being a guest on the show.
Of course.
I've been texting Jackson about, letting me come on and talk about Indiana, and I finally had an excuse to with the news this week, so he couldn't really say no this time.
Mm-hmm. And so we'll get to that at the end. The schedule is probably on the screen now. And so we are going to start with the players who have actually declared for the draft or have decided they will stay in the draft. And so this week's list is actually pretty short, and it's not really a noteworthy player, but Nate Hinton, a sophomore guard at Houston, referred to by his coach, Kelvin Sampson, as the best rebounding guard I've ever seen. He had 10.6 points per game, 8.7 rebounds. He will not return to Houston, which is a bit of a loss. They do have Quentin Grimes returning, so they do have some solid talent, but Hinton will not return. And so moving on to the transfer news, and this is the big news of the week. We have a lot of news in here. And we'll start with Romello White, Arizona State grad transfer we talked about a few weeks ago. 10.2 points per game, 8.8 rebounds, and he decides on Ole Miss. So a good pickup for Kermit Davis. Zol, one, what can you tell us kind of about this transfer? How do you think it fits in for Ole Miss? And two, do you think Ole Miss can compete in the SEC with the likes of Kentucky?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very, very talented guy. Played in the Pac-12, which is, by no stretch an easy conference. You want to say what you want about teams out west, but really they're putting up some pretty good teams every year consistently. So Arizona State is obviously no scrub team. And I'll tell you what, though, Ole Miss, they need a lot of help down there. I mean, this is a team who went below 500, both overall and in SEC play last year. If they want to beat John Calipari in Oxford, they're going to have to do a lot more work. But this is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely. They made the tournament 2 years ago. They were an 8 seed. Last year kind of fell off. Kermit Davis does have a good history in the tournament. If you remember, he was the head coach of Middle Tennessee State.
Yes, with that.
Upset over Michigan State,
yeah.
Who I had won the national championship.
I think I did too. Yeah, I think I did too.
And then I think the next year he actually led him to a 12 seed, and they beat Minnesota in maybe the most popular upset pick of the year. So good pickup for Kermit Davis and Ole Miss. And so some other players who also decided this week, DeAndre Williams, who we mentioned a few weeks ago, transferring from Evansville, who went 0-18 in MVC play. He decided on Memphis. 15.
Hey, Jackson, how much money do you think Penny Hardaway paid him to transfer to Memphis?
Not sure. Maybe as much as he paid Wiseman. Not good. A pretty good pickup for Memphis. 15.2 per game, 6.9 rebounds. They obviously got a commitment from Landers Noley, the Virginia Tech transfer a few weeks ago, but they are losing Precious. They obviously never really got Wiseman. So it's a step in the right direction for Memphis, but I'm not sold on Penny Hardaway just yet. I need to see some more winning from him.
Yeah, I mean, when you come in and your biggest recruiting class pretty much ever is tied to scandal, it's kind of hard to be optimistic, but hopefully you can rebound from a tough start.
And so another guy who decided this week, a Western Michigan junior guard who was a transfer, Michael Flowers, 16.9 points per game, was expected to go to a high major school. Instead, he chose South Alabama, who actually, I think, nearly upset Auburn last year. They lost by 1. So he decides on going there. And then another player we actually talked about last week, one of the big three from Stony Brook that transferred, Stony Brook's top three scorers all transferred. Elijah Oliani, junior guard, 18 points per game, 6.5 rebounds. He chooses the U. He's going to Miami. He's not a grad transfer, so he's going to sit one, play one, but a good pickup for Jim Larinaga. And so the other big news this week, a Wake Forest transfer chose Kentucky a few weeks ago with Oliver Sarr. And this week, Chaundi Brown chose Michigan. It's unsure if he'll get a waiver to play, but he was a junior transfer, a junior forward, 12.1 points per game, 6.5 rebounds. Zol, you're a fan of Indiana. They're in the Big Ten. They kind of had a roller coaster season up to number 4, unranked. What do you think this adds to Michigan if he can play next season? And do you think Michigan can be a contender?
I mean, when you look at the Big Ten last year, it's crazy to take a step back and think about not only how good the conference was, but how deep it was. I mean, they were about to send 11 of the 14 teams in conference to the NCAA tournament. So when you look at any team in the Big Ten last year, you have to kind of take that as you will with their record. I mean, they're playing – every road game is tough. And I think in terms of –
Except Nebraska and Northwestern.
Well, yeah. I think in terms of betting, the road team was the underdog in over 75% of regular season Big Ten play, which is crazy. And the fact that Michigan was able to, I mean, really get knocked off in the beginning a little bit. Obviously, they came in hot beating UNC when everybody thought UNC was going to be good. And then that really turned out to be not necessarily a quality win. They were overranked in the beginning of the year, but I think they kind of found their footing. They were going to be, about a mid-seed in the NCAA tournament, which is about right. And I think they got a lot to look forward to, especially if they're keeping on, building with not only recruiting classes, but transfer classes.
I mean, you look at some of the teams. I mean, Iowa could be a top 5 team in the nation next year if they return.
Yeah.
Illinois, Penn State, Rutgers. Those are 3 teams that usually aren't
You
contenders.
didn't even mention Wisconsin, who didn't lose a single person.
Wisconsin. I mean, you just talked about the plethora of teams.
Yeah.
And the plethora of talent. I mean, outside of Nebraska, Northwestern, and Northwestern was good 2 or 3 years ago. That's a ton of good teams. I mean, Michigan State is never bad. The Big Ten kind of was what the ACC was like last year. The ACC was 2 years ago. The ACC was terrible last year. I think they were going to get 3 or 4 teams in. The Big Ten was, without a doubt, the best conference.
Yeah, I mean, you can make an argument between, Big East and Big Ten, who's more top-heavy. I mean, credit to your Seton Hall Pirates. But not only them, but Creighton, Marquette was really good last year. So there were a lot of good teams in the Big East, but I don't know. I don't think that any team had the type of – or any conference had the type of depth team by team than the Big Ten did. And the Big Ten winner, Maryland, lost, 3 in conference games, which is crazy to think about, but, that's how good the Big Ten was last year.
Yeah. Maryland's a really interesting case because I saw Seton Hall play Maryland last year, and Seton Hall was missing their 2 leading scorers, and they still beat Maryland. They upset them. And I think it was the first game of a 10-game winning streak for Seton Hall. They caught complete fire. But Maryland, I mean, you feel bad for Mark Turgeon because this was supposed to be the year that Mark Turgeon really went deep in the tournament.
And they had a team to do it. I mean, when you look at their guard play, they had perimeter shooters who, if you get hot in the NCAA tournament, especially the first game of a 2-game weekend, there's nothing better. Yeah. And Maryland had the luxury of having a lot of upperclassmen guards, a lot of good 3-point shooters, and I mean that center there's
Jalen Smith.
Yeah, he taunted. I remember in the Bloomington game, he taunted the student section so many times, and as angry as you would get, you can't really do anything when a guy's putting up 20 and 15 in college.
That reminds me of there was a guy on Xavier named JP McCura, and I went to a Seton Hall game, and he started getting booed every time he touched the ball in the second half, and he played better when he iced the game. Hit a three. It was like a 4-point game. Iced the game with a three. I mean, there are players that can do that.
Yeah, I mean that's hilarious that you mentioned that because when I was at the Indiana-Wisconsin game, it was the last home game of the regular season. Indiana was a bubble team last year. Obviously, we're going to talk about that more. But we really needed a home win against Wisconsin at the end of the year. We were up, I think, 8 with 4 minutes left, and this kid who airballed a shot. It was their point guard. I think his name is Brad something.
Brad Davidson.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So he airballed a shot in the his first shot. It was in the first 3 minutes of the game. Every time he touched the ball from that point on, the entire fan section, and not only the fan section, but the entire Assembly Hall arena just chanted airball at the poor kid. And he didn't make a shot for the rest of the game. But he got put on the free throw line with a 1-and-1 opportunity to seal it when they were up 2 after a big comeback. And he hit both of them. And he just looked at the crowd and gave them a big shush. And it was so just disheartening because this is a guy who we pretty much bullied the entire game, and he got the last laugh.
So we'll get more into Indiana a little bit more.
I'm sorry.
But of course. And so moving on to the pending transfer news, not a ton of pending transfer news. Just one guy who's on the move this week but didn't declare, Bach Gatch. Utah sophomore guard, 10.7 points per game. He will transfer if he withdraws from the NBA draft, so we'll have more news on him in the future.
Name.
An awesome name. And another awesome name is the main guy that decided he's returning this week. A guy I've seen live. His name is Fats Russells. I feel like he's been in college forever, but next year will be his senior year, 18.8 18.8 points per game at a URI team that was on the bubble last year. And we'll get into a bit more of Atlantic 10 bubble teams in a second. But he returns next year. Zol, do you think Fats Russell can be an All-American next year? And secondly, do you think URI has a chance to run the table in the Atlantic 10?
I mean, there's a big spot up for grabs with Cassius Winston, who was pretty much penciled in as an All-American the past 2 years at guard, graduating. So he's obviously got a shot, and it's better for teams, or I should say, it's better for a player with maybe not in like a mid-major. Obviously, not the A10 isn't a mid-major, but they're not a power conference school, Power 5 school. So it's easier for them to put up, better numbers. Not playing quality opponents day in and day out. So he definitely has an opportunity. And I really want to keep an eye on this guy's draft stock too.
And so the other Atlantic 10 news we have coincides with each other is Richmond. They have 2 guys returning. Grant Golden, 13.4 points per game, 6.9 rebounds, and Jacob Gilliard, 12.7 points per game. Richmond actually did better than URI in conference play last year. I'm pretty sure they beat Wisconsin in non-conference play. So they were right in the running for a bubble spot. In terms of what I'm thinking, I think that Richmond may be the favorite. I mean, URI is getting a bunch of guys as well. So it's kind of interesting to see. I know that they got a transfer from UConn. They lost a transfer to UConn. They lost Tyrese Martin. But in my opinion, and I mean, if you don't want to talk about this, Greg, you don't have to. But I think Richmond is going to be the favorite in the Atlantic 10. I mean, Dayton is waiting largely on the decision of Jalen Crutcher. Obi Toppin's already gone. But, I mean, I think that – I mean, it's Richmond's conference to lose because it was a 3-horse race last year. It was Dayton, and then it was Richmond, and it was URI, and then St. Louis and Duquesne were kind of hanging around. But I don't know if they can make the jump.
Let me just say, I feel so bad for every person associated with the Dayton basketball. This was their 1 year. This was their 1 year, and they didn't even get the opportunity to play in March. I still can't get over the fact that we didn't have a March Madness this year, and it upsets me almost every day.
It's extremely – I mean, I don't think there's anything I look forward to more than March Madness.
Yeah.
So that is some of your Atlantic 10 news. 2 other guys who also said they're returning. Darren Green, a guy we mentioned a few weeks ago, he was a freshman at UCF. He's returning 10.1 points per game. And then Jared West, a junior guard at Marshall. He was All-Conference USA third team, 14.2 points per game, 4.1 assists. He is returning as well. And so moving on to our scheduling news, we're going to talk about all the scheduling news, and then we're going to ask Greg what he thinks his favorite game is. Mississippi State said they're hosting North Texas from Conference USA. North Texas returning almost everyone, and they did win the Conference USA regular season title last year. Oklahoma and Florida will start a home-and-home series next season. The game next season will be at Florida. Ole Miss will be hosting Memphis. And then the 2021 Hall of Fame Classic will be Arkansas, Illinois, Cincinnati, and Kansas State. Greg, which of these games sounds most interesting to you?
Well, if it was football, it would obviously be a home-and-home between Oklahoma and Florida. But, I mean, I know it's a year in advance, but I always love these, like, Hall of Fame Classics or, like, the Maui Invitational, like, all these, like, non-conference tournaments that these teams do for fun in the non-conference schedule part of the college basketball season. Really trying to find your foot as a basketball team, trying to find a new identity for the year. And you're doing it against people that, like, you don't normally play. I don't know when the last time Illinois played Kansas State. Like, that's just an example of some of the fun out-of-conference matchups that you get from those invitational tournaments or those, like, classic tournaments that they kind of make up every year. And I always love them. They're my favorite part of the non-conference schedule of college basketball, at least. So I'm looking forward to that.
And I asked this question last week, but I actually want to ask you, do you think the Maui Invitational is losing steam as the premier non-conference tournament? Do you think that the talent is more diluted?
There's no shot. I mean, what other tournament do you see Gonzaga play? Gonzaga plays when you think about it, Gonzaga plays their only meaningful game in the Maui Invitational tournament.
Do you know Gonzaga was in the battle for Atlantis last year? They lost to Michigan in the final.
I did not know that. I thought they were a Maui Invitational staple. I don't know. Maybe I'm just a smart few wearing like one of those tropical shirts.
To be fair, the game, the biggest preseason conference tournament game last year was that overtime win for Kansas over Dayton and Maui.
Yes.
So Maui does. I don't know
if you remember 2 years ago at the Maui Invitational when it was the Zion Duke team versus how do you say his name?
Rui Hachimura.
Hachimura, sorry, and that Gonzaga team.
That was, and Gonzaga won that.
They did.
So I mean, a team that notoriously uses the these non-conference tournaments is Kentucky. I mean, Kentucky, especially last year's team with Tyler Hero, they were really bad at the beginning of the year. They lost, I think, to Duke in the Champions Classic at the beginning of the year by like 30. And then as the season got on, I think they won the SEC. They were a 2 seed. They got to the Elite 8. They really kind of progress as the season goes on. So I agree with you. There's a lot of really interesting games, and it gives teams a chance to play out-of-conference opponents they don't see usually. So moving on to our other news section, which is actually quite busy. So we will list the 3 bits of news. The first bit is at Green Bay, and no, not the Green Bay Packers, the University of Green Bay. They fired their head coach, Link Darner. He was 92-80, 12 games above 500 in the Horizon League. This was apparently a huge shock. I don't follow the Horizon League super closely, but this was apparently a pretty big shock. It wasn't like he had been doing too bad, and he was contracted until 2026. So that is some big news. Then also the NCAA has denied a one-time waiver for the 2021 season, so we may be seeing more news on that. We don't know if it's just overall denied or like if players like Wake Forest transfers because their coach got fired, maybe they'll still be eligible. We've talked about it a bit in the past, though, so we're actually going to talk about something else. There was some news that Stephen F. Austin, the team that usually the Lumberjacks run the Southland Conference, but they will not be representing the Southland Conference in the 2022 NCAA tournament. That is because they will be banned from postseason play due to having low APR scores, which is basically an academic metric of how your team is performing. And so they will not the next tournament, but the season after, they will not be in the NCAA tournament. Greg, what do you make of this situation? This is obviously, it happens before, but not to a team as big as Stephen F. Austin. What do you make of this situation?
I mean, I can't help but feel like it's something that is so easily preventable, right? I mean, they really have nobody to blame but themselves. And when it comes to academics, I mean, everybody wants to joke about college basketball players not getting paid and stuff, but like they're there for school, and I think it gets lost on a lot of student athletes. And this is a perfect example of it. I mean, yeah.
I mean, you look at Mick Cronin had a speech a few years ago after the brawl between Xavier and Cincinnati, and he really preached that the players are there for academics. I mean, some players will go play across seas once they're finished, but you are there for the education. I mean, you look at a lot of guys that return for their senior year, Cassius Winston, Miles Powell, Marcus Howard. One of the reasons they cite for coming back is to be able to get the degree. So, I mean, I don't know how the entire process works with this, but, I mean, Stephen F. Austin is a team that continuously dominates their conference. You feel like that this is – I mean, maybe they can appeal it or something, but you feel like this is a pretty rare situation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like we were all fair talking about a situation that came up, what was it, 2-3 years ago?
Yeah, with Stetson. So if you remember a few years ago, Stetson in the Atlantic Sun actually had the same situation. They could not make the NCAA tournament because of their APR scores were too low, but they were allowed to play in the conference tournament for reasons that aren't really known. They were the 7 seed, and they actually made it all the way to the final, and they played the 4 seed Florida Gulf Coast. And so if Stetson won, then the number 1 overall seed in the tournament, North Florida, would make the tournament. And if they lost, obviously Florida Gulf Coast would take it. Very weird situation. Florida Gulf Coast won at the end of the day. I highly doubt the same thing will happen to Stephen F. Austin. They probably –
Yeah, I don't think so either. I just think it's very rare that you see something like this turned into a noteworthy situation.
Yeah.
When it comes to – I don't want to say a high-profile team because obviously Stephen F. Austin, even if they make the tournament, they're still a double-digit seed. But they're still a team that's predominantly winning their conference as a mid-major school. Like, there are so many mid-major programs that kind of get built up as a powerhouse within their conference, and they look forward to winning their conference rather than being in the NCAA tournament. And anything at that point is just a bonus. So.
Not that Stephen F. Austin hasn't had success. I mean, they took down 5-seeded VCU a few years ago, took down 3-seeded West Virginia a few years ago, so they've had the success there.
Exactly.
They've been fantastic. But an unfortunate situation. We are going to move on to our Indiana preview, and we'll first talk about the news that sparked this. So Christian Lander, a 5-star guard, class of 2021 for Indiana, has reclassified to the class of 2020. So he will be enrolling at Indiana next year. So basically the Hoosiers are getting a 5-star guard that they didn't really expect, but it doesn't hurt to get a 5-star recruit on your team. So Greg, how does he – basically I'm not going to ask how he fits into the picture. Just give our viewers the team preview of what we can expect from Indiana and your expectations for them.
Okay. So before I say anything, I think it's important to know the state of Archie Miller's Indiana basketball program. He came into kind of a mess that Tom Crean left him. I think Tom Crean was a phenomenal coach, but the back end of the time of Indiana, I mean, he lacked in recruiting, and it really showed. And, I mean, it's crazy to think that Archie Miller came into this Indiana team with, I think, 4 scholarship players. And 2 of them were the 2 most recent graduates, Devontae Green, who we can do a whole 30-minute episode about Devontae Green and his play style and how I think he's a sloppy basketball player and selfish and everything like that. And Deron Davis, who was a bench player who really was just there to take up fouls because he was battling a bunch of injuries throughout his career, and he can never find his footing as a player, which is unfortunate. But Archie Miller came into those 2 guys as pretty much their biggest recruits, and he had to fix the program. And 3 years later, all of those guys are out, and they lost nobody else. Like, this Indiana team is starting every single player that started for them last year, with the exception of Devontae Green, who wouldn't even start most games. So we're going to have a rotation of Al Durham and Rob Finney at the point, which is what we had last year. And adding on top of that, I mean, the number one point guard in the 2021 class, Christian Lander, who's probably going to start over, I think, Al Durham, if I had to guess, just based on Rob Finney's play style as a defender. But you're looking at a guy who's athletic. He can make perimeter shots, which is something that Indiana desperately needs. And he's going to be able to run the pick and roll with Trace Jackson Davis. Trace Jackson Davis obviously was the best freshman in Big Ten last year. He, I believe, won the Big Ten Freshman of the Year award at the end of the season. And he could have went to the NBA, but he's just not big enough. I don't know if you've seen him play at all, but
we did talk about him. We mentioned him on key players returning, but I haven't seen him play.
The one play that really sticks out to me is we were playing Maryland at home. It was a 1-point game, and we had the ball. We gave him the ball in the low post, and he's working against that Maryland center we were talking about, Jalen. What was his name? Jalen. Yeah. And he had a great look at it. Low post, turnaround jump, and he just rimmed out. And it's plays like that where if he's a little bit bigger, if he could stay in the paint a little bit more, and he can kind of dominate the low post rather than taking a fadeaway jump shot, it's plays like that where we really need to see an improvement from him, which is why I don't think he was NBA ready yet. And the fact that he's coming back as talented as he is with the touch that he has and the ability to put on some weight, I think that'll be a big game changer.
What do you think the team's ceiling is next year? Do you think it's like – in terms of seeding for the NCAA tournament, what would you like to see the team be?
I mean, I've seen such a wide range of Indiana basketball teams game by game in my 2 years. I mean, people forget that Indiana blew out Florida State by 20 at home in December of this year. And Florida State ended up being probably a 1 or 2 seed. And
top 5 team.
Yeah, and here's Indiana trying to make the tournament. It's crazy, but I'm really excited for next year. I don't want to set my expectations too high, but I mean, we're not losing anybody. Everybody's gaining a year of experience, and we're getting a good recruiting class already. We had 2 3-stars and 1 4-star, all from the state of Indiana, pretty much filling the needs that we need. 2 of them are perimeter shooters. One of them was a big who's kind of replacing Deron Davis in case we need somebody to come off the bench and take fouls. We got guys like Joey Brunk and Race Thompson, who came out of nowhere last year and can kind of play that big man in the center so that Trace can kind of work the perimeter stretch a little bit. And we got good guards too. I mean, especially with Lander. So I think this is a team that if everything goes well, we can compete for a Big Ten championship.
Well, Greg, I'd like to thank you for coming on today. Really appreciate the Big Ten preview. You give a much better view of Indiana.
Well, let me tell you, it's not going to be easy in the Big Ten next year. I mean, Iowa might be the best team in college basketball if Luke Garza comes back.
I thought Luke Garza was the best player in college basketball last year. No offense, Obi Toppin was fantastic, but putting up 20, I think what was it, 25 and 10 in the Big Ten, I think is extremely impressive. I mean, I have no problem with them giving it to Obi Toppin, but if Luka Garza returns next year, I'd say I was the favorite, but I mean, Indiana's returning everyone. Rutgers is returning everyone.
Wisconsin's returning everybody. Illinois doesn't seem like they're losing a lot of talent. I mean, this is going to be a conference that's going to be hard to win again next year. And I think Indiana can be right at the top of that. If everything falls into place, Archie Miller can kind of prove he's not just a recruiting guy and he's an X's and O's guy. And if he can, let me tell you, his seat's going to get hot. I mean, it's been 4 years now. All of his guys are in. You know, he's spent the past 4 years building recruiting classes. The first class that he recruited is going to be seniors this year. So there's no excuses. There's nowhere to hide. This is the roster you built, so you can't blame it on the talent. He's got to start doing well in-game coaching. And I think if he can, and I think if Indiana can win a couple of those games that last year you looked at it and said, hey, we might have lost because we didn't have the better coach, we can be onto something.
Once again, Greg, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show, talking about some of the news, giving a great Indiana preview. Obviously, even when there's no college basketball going on, a ton of news, and love giving previews from people who can really delve into how the team is doing. Good luck to Hoosiers next year, and
Jackson.
if you guys like this content, like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next week.